All right, so we are back with round two. Make sure again you have your notebooks out and also your book. We're going to be starting on page 20. All right, so this is different than the historical aspect of chapter one. The first 20 pages, excuse me, we're looking at the history of psychology. Okay, so all the way from Aristotle and Descartes to present day, really looking at the historical figures, the perspectives. Remember, there are 8 perspectives. We use the hand, right? Now go ahead and turn to page 20, and we will get started. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm going to go through probably the first 10 pages or so. And then I will go through the other few pages, just kind of pointing out some things I think you might have trouble with, but I'm not going to do the going over the notes and kind of guiding you through that process. Okay. Remember, this is just not to replace your own note taking. This is to kind of help guide you into learning your own what works for you. Okay. Let's get started. All right. So again, we're on page 20. I am not going to be going through the scientific method with you. I mean, you're pretty much all of you are seniors, some are juniors, and you should know the scientific method. The only thing I will say is, again, look for the italicized words. That word might show up in a question or two. Okay. So, perceiving the question, forming a hypothesis. And then go ahead and testing hypothesis, drawing conclusions, reporting your results, okay? Again, italicized words and any bold words are going to be very important here, okay? So, keep going. All right, so again, pause the video if you need to go through. I highly encourage you to pause the video and go through and take notes over those first 2 or 3 pages. All right, so now what we're going to get into is how do we go about answering psychological questions, okay? What this requires us to do is look at the different ways. You can see here in this video, I am working on getting you access to the online book so you can watch these videos, but how can we use laboratories, observing individuals in their natural habitat? How can we use these methods to learn what we seek to learn? So how do we answer the big questions of psychology? Well, the first thing we're going to look at is what is called naturalistic observation. So as we're reading through this, okay, sometimes all researchers need to know is what is happening to a group of animals or people. The best way to look at behavior in animals is to watch them behave in their normal environment. So I think that this is important here. So watching it in their normal environment. That's why animal researchers go where the animals live, watch them eat, play. With people, researchers might want to observe them in their workplaces or homes or on playgrounds. Okay, so there's a distinction there. We don't need to write that down, but there's a distinction that watching animals is going to require to go where they live and where they exist. Okay, whereas with people, people exist in way more places than animals do, and so it's not like you're going to just observe them in their home where they live. No, you might go to where they work or where they spend their leisure time, maybe at a restaurant, a playground if you're trying to observe kids. So naturalistic observation. For each one that we go through, there's going to be positives and negatives, advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so first, advantages of naturalistic observation. It allows researchers to get a realistic picture, okay, of how behaviors occurs. Okay. Again, notice how I'm only doing, I don't do the entire sentence because the entire sentence isn't the important part. In fact, I could just do skip the it, allows researchers realistic picture of behavior. That's really all I would need to write, right? But because it's not as easy to just highlight, I'm highlighting just part of the sentence, okay? Okay, so the positive of this is because if you're in a laboratory, you might get behavior that's not real, okay? That's because you're bringing, if I brought people in, like when we do the Solomon Asch experiment on conformity, this is, our classroom is going to be a laboratory. When we show them different sizes of lines and say which is bigger, that is going to make it a lot more difficult. It's not going to make it as genuine as it would be if I were to just walk into a classroom and observe students. Okay. Now, specific behavior to record and how they're going to record it. Okay. Now, here's the negative. So these are the positives, right? The advantages. You get a realistic picture, you get more genuine behavior than if you were in a laboratory, and you have to have like what behavior you're going to record. Now, there is a problem though with using this, okay? If they know they're being watched, okay, they do not behave normally, okay? This is the observer effect, okay? So again, bold word, we're writing the sentence before it, okay? Animals not behave normally. That is the observer effect, okay? So now, in the example that we had earlier of like the teenagers in the mall, okay, if you're trying to disguise yourself, okay, that allows you to get a more realistic, because they don't know that they're being observed. Even though they are being observed, you are not an obvious observer, okay? So when we look at, if you use like a one-way mirror, they might actually become participants in a group. This is a technique called participant observation, okay? Naturalistic observation in which the observer becomes a participant in the group being observed. So what that is, that means that if and I used to do this before the whole Rona, is I would send groups of students to the library during class, right? And I'd say, observe the students in the library. But I would have you sit at the table that all the other students that are working are sitting at. And so you are no longer somebody observing them in their eyes. You are one of them, and therefore their behavior tends to be more genuine, okay? So the observer bias, right? This happens when the person has a particular opinion. So we are not perfect, okay? If I tell let's say like I'm a teacher and I'm in class and all of my students are terrible kids, okay? They're cussing, they're throwing books, paper, blah, blah, blah. And it's horrible. And I can't teach, it's like I'm losing my mind. So I go to my principal and I tell him, hey, these kids are awful, right? And I say, you need to come in and you need to help me figure out what to do, right? And I tell him, come in first block, okay? Well, he misunderstands and he comes in during third block, and those students are great. Those students I don't have any problem with, right? And I'm teaching, and he comes in and he's like, oh my God, they're horrible, okay? The reason that happens is if the person doing the observing has an opinion about what he or she expects to see, they will see that, okay? And that just kind of invalidates everything that is discovered there, okay? So how you can avoid this is a blind observer. So this is, they don't know what the research question is, okay? They don't know what they should see or what they shouldn't see. It is about it is just, hey, what do you see? Okay. And then I'll let you go through this one to find another disadvantage. All right, now we're on to laboratory observations, okay? So naturalistic observation, again, looks like we have a lot, right? And you can boil it down. Remember, don't write every single word, okay? I'm highlighting all these words because it's just easier than trying to like click and be very tedious. So now, laboratory observation. Okay, sometimes observing behavior in animals or people is not practical in the natural setting. Let's say you're going to observe fish and their behavior, okay? Well, we can't breathe underwater. We can put on a bunch of equipment, but then that's not a good way of observing fish because it's very obvious where they're at. Whereas if we can get them into a laboratory in a controlled tank, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more doable, okay? Or if we're trying to observe people, I always think of the laboratory setting, if you've seen the show Impractical Jokers, and where they have those, what are those, focus groups? That is more of a laboratory observation because they don't know that they're being observed, okay? So if we want to, in this book, observe the reaction of infants to a mirror image of themselves and to record the reactions, okay? That kind of equipment you can't really do, right? So how are we going to do it, right? How are we going to be able to observe or set up this scenario, okay? It's very controlled, which is one of the top things. But the disadvantage is it's an artificial situation, which can lead to artificial behavior, okay? We don't want artificial behavior because then that's not a true representation of what we are trying to determine. You know, you react differently, right? Because we could say that naturalistic observation occurs when like a principal comes in, but you could also into a classroom, but you could also say that it is a laboratory setting because it is in a very controlled area, right? Because the teacher is exerting some sort of control, but there's still that random aspect of student behavior. However, if we say that the classroom is like a laboratory and a principal comes in, all of a sudden the students are behaving not like they typically would because they know that they're being observed and they know that they're in a very controlled setting and they should behave a certain way, right? Like I said, it does have a degree of control, okay? All right, next one, case study. Again, bold word, gonna wanna highlight that. Okay, so there's a couple different cases that you could go into, okay? I want you to highlight both of them, okay? I'm not gonna highlight them because I'll let you decide what is important here to highlight, okay? So Sigmund Freud based his entire theory on psychoanalysis on case studies of his patients. So he gathered information about their childhood, relationships, blah, 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 and then he formed his basis of his theory. The reason that this is possible is because if you use a case study, you can get a tremendous amount of detail about a particular case. So if you have a patient that experiences severe depression and their life experiences are very unique, then that's an opportunity to have a case study because not a lot of patients that you might see have that particular life experiences leading to the severe depression that individual has or presents. So what's another good example? Well, you got the dude Phineas Gage. Now this dude will show up on your real AP exam, like the full-blown AP exam. You're going to see this guy, Phineas Gage. So what happened with this guy is he was worked on a railroad, and he was trying to clear debris, stuck a stick of dynamite into the ground, put down a piece of bar, right? Just like this. And then it blew up, went through straight through his head. Okay. What that ended up doing was removing most of his frontal lobe, leading to a drastic change in behavior and personality. And this allowed just changes whole who he was. Okay. So very good example, because there's not a lot of times we can be like, hey, we're going to blow out half of your brain and we're going to see what happens to you. Okay. Okay. No, you can't do that. This freak accident then allowed for the individual Phineas Gage to be studied. And no other circumstances would we ever be able to do that, right? But if the situation presents itself naturally, then psychologists have the ability to then study. However, the disadvantage here, you can't apply what you find to other people, okay? Because it is so, you cannot take one scenario and make it the rule. You can't. So maybe a key word here is it's not generalizable to others. All right, surveys. We're going to do quite a bit with surveys in chapter 4, I believe. When we look at sleep, you're going to be developing a survey. So what can surveys do? Well, if you're trying to get a lot of information from a large amount of people, doing that individually would be very difficult. And so what you can do is survey a lot of people, okay? You can have telephone, internet, questionnaires, okay? The questions used in interviews, telephone can vary, but usually the questions in survey are all the same for everyone, okay? So there's that level of control. All right, so whatever you think there. Again, pause this if I'm ever going too fast, trying to keep it relatively short. All right, so there are big advantages to the survey, okay? One is you can get a lot of private information. If I were to ask you, have you ever used illegal drugs to your face, you're gonna be like, me, no. Drugs, don't know what those are. Where if I asked you in a survey and you knew that were 100% anonymous, then you would be more likely to be honest, okay? The disadvantages, they have to be very careful about the group of people they survey. So if they want to find out what college freshmen think about politics, you can't ask every single freshman. So you have to select a representative sample, okay? A representative sample means it is a sample of students that is representative of the entire population, okay? Here's the key thing, random selection, okay? You randomly select 100 students out of the entire population, okay? Why random? Because it needs to be representative. So if you randomly select people, the odds that it will be representative are very high, okay? Because what if you didn't randomly select them, you could just maybe pick your favorite students, or maybe students that you like their ideas, and all of a sudden this is not representative of the entire group, it is representative of the people you like, and that's very different. Participants are people that are part of the study. Okay, the other major disadvantage, people aren't always going to give researchers accurate answers, okay? They can lie. Have you ever lied? A dumb question, the answer is yes. You have lied. But when you go through and you're trying to, if the questionnaire is anonymous, all of a sudden you may be more likely to tell the truth, but that's not always the case, okay? You may still lie. If I asked you, have you ever killed somebody, and the answer for you is yes, you're still going to say no because of the nature of the questionnaire, okay? Being that that is the case, you can sometimes correct for it by having trying to account for courtesy bias. Okay, so people deliberately give answers they think are socially acceptable, so people don't get offended. So this courtesy bias might have to be taken into account. So if there's a question on the exam that says the researchers want to answer the question of how much cheating goes on in relationships, right? They might have to account, what thing might they have to account for? And that would be courtesy bias. Okay. All right, now we are moving on to the end of the chapter, looking into our concept maps. Okay, so right now what I want you to do is pause it and go ahead and answer these questions. Okay, fill this out in your notes. Answer these questions. Remember, these questions might show up on quizzes or tests. All right, so now that we have our 4 methods in which you can collect data, right? Data about behavior. Now what we're doing is, how can we now use that data to find relationships between certain variables? Okay, so our first thing, bullet point 1.9, what is the correlational technique and what does it tell researchers about relationships? So what we're only doing so far is trying to describe behavior. Okay, two methods that allow researchers to know more than just a description of what has happened: correlation and experiments. Okay, so I would highlight that. Okay, so with the observation surveys, you're just kind of describing what people are saying. However, when you are wanting to do more than just describe what is happening, okay, then you need to use correlations or experiments. Okay, correlation is a statistical technique in which you organize numerical information, where you try to find patterns. Okay, you're looking for patterns in the information, so I definitely put that with correlation. Patterns. Okay, so correlation, what is it? Well, measuring the relationship between 2 variables. All right, measuring the relationship between 2 variables. What is a variable? It's something you can change. All right, a variable is anything that can change. So temperature, alertness, performance on a test. Okay, for example, they might not know whether cigarette smoking is connected to life expectancy, the number of years a person can be expected to live. So obviously they're just like, hey, do you smoke? Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna wait here until you die. Is that okay? No, you can't do that. So the only way is to find out if smoking behavior and life expectancy are related is to use other medical records of people who have already died. So once you die, those medical records would then be reviewed. And if you smoked and you died 10 years earlier, and then that doesn't mean anything. Okay, you could have been hit by a bus, had no relationship. But if you then look at tens of thousands of people and you find that if they smoked, they died 10 years earlier, then all of a sudden you can now produce what's known as a correlation coefficient. Okay, so now the researcher has 2 sets of numbers for each person: the number of years that they smoked and the age that they died. Now they can develop a correlation coefficient. This is not a statistics class. I do not expect you to know how to develop this, but you do need to know what it means. So there is directions of relationships when it comes to correlations. So it's either going to go up or it's going to go down. Okay, so if I guess I'll do that. in class. So the direction of the relationship, okay? Does life expectancy go up or down as smoking increases? So in terms of correlation, it's your R is the correlation. So if a researcher find out that more cigarettes a person smoked, the younger the person was when he or she died, it would mean the correlation between the two variables is negative. As smoking goes up, life expectancy goes down. Any inverse relationship is negative, okay? If they're both going down, it is not negative, okay? Do not be fooled by both going down. The only way that it is negative, it is if it's an inverse. The strength of a relationship between the variables is determined on a range between 1 and -1. Okay, the reason it can't be greater than -1 or less, or positive one or less than -1 is you need to picture it on a line. Okay, it cannot go past +1 or -1. Okay, so we can now plot this. If the relationship is a strong one, the number will be closer to +1 or -1. A correlation of plus 0.89, for example, would be very strong positive correlation. Okay, so that means it was going up as X increases, Y increases. Okay, the closer they are to perfect correlation, right, closer to that imaginary line, then the closer to 1 it will be. The less it is close to that imaginary line, the closer to 0 it's going to be. The closer to 0 it's going to be, it means nothing. It's the weaker relationship. So notice the number 0 makes it a weaker relationship. So relationships would probably find that the correlation between people's weight and the number of freckles they have would be 0, because it doesn't make any difference if you're overweight or not, or underweight or not, if compared to the freckles you have. Okay. Now, remember that correlation does not prove causation. For example, guess what? The more ice cream that is sold, the more murders occur. Say that again. The more ice cream that is sold, the amount of murders that are committed go up. So what does that mean? Does that mean that people who buy ice cream are all of a sudden murderers? No. There is another factor in there that is not described or evident in that scenario. And that is, when do people buy ice cream? When it's hot outside. And so heat does have an effect on behavior. And so that heat is actually leading to more of a causation of the murder rate going up. But again, I cannot prove causation with that alone. Okay, I would need to then develop an experiment in order to prove that. Okay. Again, it only tells the relationship between two variables and the direction of the relationship. That is it. Okay, that is the only thing that it shows. Now, one thing I am going to attempt to prove in my master's degree is, because I have to set up a action research project, is number of hours of sleep that students have is correlated with attendance problems, low GPA, and behavioral problems. So I can develop and find correlation between that, but I would have to do a lot more to prove causation. All right. All right, experiment. So the only method that will allow researchers to determine causes of behavior is an experiment. So what do? You deliberately manipulate variables while holding other variables constant and see what happens. Okay. So if we looked at the example of aggressive behavior by watching video of violent cartoons would lead to aggressive behavior. Okay. First, how do we select the children? So the best method is random assignment. Okay. Now this is going to be very important because I'm going to have you develop your own experiment and it needs to follow these rules. So be very aware of what methods scientists or psychologists used to develop their own experiments. So they randomly select children from a population. Okay. Then they'd have to go to the daycare centers to randomly select. So they have the population. That does not mean that they are that those are the children they're going to use. They have the population from which they're going to randomly select children. Okay. So variables. So what do we have to take into consideration here? Okay. Okay. So the example is aggressive behavior in children cartoons. The variable researchers think causes changes in aggressive behavior is the violence in cartoons. Okay. So what are we going to manipulate? What are we going to leave alone? So researchers want to manipulate that in some way in order to they have to define the term violent cartoons. So violent cartoons needs an operational definition. Okay. Operational definition we will go over in class. All right. I'm going to try to figure out some way to have that work, but we'll try. So an operational definition of aggressive behavior might be a checklist. Okay. Then independent, dependent variables. I want you to do this on your own. Okay. So the name of the variable that is manipulated, independent. I'll let you decide what to write there. Pause it if you need to. Okay. And the response of the participants to the manipulation of the independent variable. So again, independent variable is what you mess with. The dependent variable is the response. So if you mess with something, their response would then be the dependent variable. Okay. So again, you're going to want to include this. It's the measurable response. Okay. Measurable response. One thing you need to keep in mind, though, is whether the behavior of the experiment participants will be altered as a result of being a part of the study itself. Okay. So will them being in this, right? Will them being a part of the experiment change the behavior? All right, confounding variables, variables that might interfere with your results that you did not take into consideration. Okay. So what if you were looking, and again, the experiment with the children is you wanted to see if violent cartoons impact aggressive behavior. And you randomly select and you do everything correctly. You have your population, you randomly select students from that population by some way. Then you look at children that, yes, they observe violent cartoons. And then you find that, oh, children that watch violent cartoons tend to be more aggressive. But what if, and you didn't take this into consideration, that they came from aggressive homes? So they are viewing aggressive behavior in real life. They also are through TV, but they are also observing it in real life. So what if that is what's causing the behavior? That is a confounding variable, and that's something you need to take into consideration. Okay, experimental group, control group, random assignment. Okay, so random assignment of participants to one or the other. experimental or control group is the best way to ensure control over other interfering or extraneous variables. Okay, extraneous, that's a word. Okay, if researchers simply looked at children and put all the children from one daycare center in one pediatrician's recommendation into the experimental group, and the same for the control group, they'd run the risk of biasing their research. Okay, some daycare centers may try and control their whether or not the students watch certain violent shows. Okay, or they might have children that are aggressive. Maybe they're younger, maybe they're older, maybe they have some predisposition to aggressive behavior that they did not try to take into account. Okay, so there's a placebo effect and the experimenter effect. Okay, these are two things that can mess up an experiment. Okay, so the placebo effect you may have heard of. Okay, this is the expectation that the participant in the study can influence their behavior. So if, let's say, I give you a pill and then you take that pill and I say to you that if you take this pill, your headache will go away. Well, then they take the pill and all boom, their headache goes away. I have this magic pill now. But what if I gave that same pill to somebody and I didn't tell them what it did? They have a headache, but I gave it to them and I said, here, take this. They're like, what does it do? And I said, it makes your skin itchy. And they take it and all of a sudden their skin itches. Well, all of a sudden this sugar pill, this pill does nothing. And I tell them and they all of a sudden believe that it will do something and then it does. Okay. But the only reason for that is their brain told them that it was going to, not the pill doing it. Okay. Another way that an experiment, expectations about the outcome of the experiment can influence the results, even when the participants are animals rather than people, is called the experimenter effect. It has to do with the expectations of the experimenter, not the participant. So if I think that doing this certain thing to a group of dogs is going to change the dog's behavior, I may then interpret their behavior as it lining up to what I thought it was going to. Okay. Now, how can we control for these, right? How can we prevent these from happening? Well, we're going to get into single blind and double blind studies, okay? Blind, okay, I want you to think of just the word blind here, all right? So, if I am studying you and I give you either the experimental treatment or the control treatment, you don't know which one you're getting, okay? That means you are blind to whatever treatment you're receiving, okay? Now, so guess what I'd use? You can see in this experiment that when teachers were told that some students had a high potential for success and others low potential, the students showed significant gains and decreases in their performance on standardized tests, depending on which potential that they were supposed to have. Actually, the students have been selected randomly as whether they were high or low. Okay. The study and similar ones after it highlighted the need for the experiment to be blind as well. So double blind. Okay. What's interesting there is the expectancy. So when I am teaching you in class or when you are about to test, what do I say? I say, you're going to do great. Okay. I looked at all of your scores and you are very high performing. Good job. That means that you are going to do great in this class. Okay. Me saying that is going to then influence your expectancy to perform well. All right. This is an example of something similar. All right. So how are we going to describe the information that we gather? right? How are we going to measure and communicate our findings? Well, that is going to be what you are going to read and find out, okay? We are looking at statistics in psychology, 1.13, okay? I encourage you to, if you see a table, okay, because we're done now, but if you see a table, like table 1.1, okay, I want you to have that in your notes, transcribe that into your notes. Same with figure 1.4, figure 1.5, figure 1.6, okay? All of these, I want you to put in your notes and then put whatever notes that you think are important with that next to it, okay? So if I have this frequency distribution in my notes, I'm going to then write all the notes that are from frequency distribution with that, all right? Okay, we will go over this in class, don't worry. But for right now, I want you to make sure your notes are solid. And actually, I think you can stop reading at page 46. Okay, you do not have to read to page 48. Stop at page 46. Okay, so 34 to 46 are going to be on your own. But again, if you see a table, if you see a graph, I want you to write that in. Okay. All right. Actually, you can stop at page 42. Okay. Ethics and psychology, you don't have to take notes on those, but if they show up on the quiz, obviously you can use reading, but stop at page 42 with your notes. Okay. We will then continue that in class. So that is all that I have for you. So if you have any questions throughout this, please let me know. Shoot me a text. Again, the quiz is for people with N through M is going to be due Monday, so tomorrow night by midnight. And those A to N, M, whatever it is going to be Tuesday by midnight. Okay? So take the notes. Again, look at it's only 43 minutes, and that's with me talking. So you could probably get through this a lot faster. It's just I'm kind of help guiding you this. All right. So have a great rest of your day and see you next time I see you.